We're going to continue with our discussion of the millennium. So we started with that last period, but we're going to continue on with that today. We're making a case for what would be considered a premillennial understanding of the millennium, that the second coming of Christ occurs and then the millennium takes place. So although there's a certain sense in which currently we're in a phase of the kingdom program, when it comes to the millennial phase of the kingdom program, that's something that's for the future. I did want to draw your attention to Zechariah 14, which I think has implications for the millennium. And then we'll get back to our more specific discussion of Revelation 20. But I want you to notice here some things going on. I think what you see in Zechariah 14 is that there is a siege of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is under attack. The Lord is going to appear, deliver the people of Israel, establish a kingdom on earth, and then you see various conditions within that period. But as you're looking through Zechariah 14, be asking yourself as we're working through this, when has this or when will this find fulfillment? In Zechariah chapter 14, verse 1, it says, "Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you." Then when you get to verse 2, it says, "For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half of the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city." So it's important to understand here there's some sort of negative siege that is taking place here in regard to Jerusalem. And initially here, it's not going very well. The city is captured and houses plundered, women ravished, etc. But then notice what happens in verse 3. "Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle." So notice here, the Lord's going to go forth and fight against those nations that are sieging Jerusalem. That's part of the reason why I think this is different than what's being talked about in Luke 21, 20 to 24, when it talks about armies surrounding Jerusalem, and then there's wrath and vengeance to the people of Jerusalem, which seems to lead to a times of the Gentiles. As I told you before, I think that was fulfilled in AD 70 with continuing results until today. What's taking place here is a siege of Jerusalem that's met by the Lord fighting against those nations. Verse 4, "In that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east." I don't know about you, but that sounds like the second coming of Christ to me. Remember on the day of his ascension in Acts 1, from the Mount of Olives, it was promised that he was going to come back in the same way that he had left. So notice it's in the context of the siege against Jerusalem. The Lord goes, he fights against those nations. Then in verse 4, "In that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east." And the Mount of Olives, notice the geographical changes here. The Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half the mountain will move toward the north and the other half toward the south. I would take it, since the Lord's coming is literal, I would take it that these changes are literal as well. Verse 5 says, "You will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him." Verse 6, "It will come about in that day that there will be no light, the luminaries will dwindle." So it appears that there's cosmic signs associated with this. "For it will be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but it will come about that at evening there will be light. And it will come about in that day that living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, and the other half toward the western sea. It will be in summer as well as in winter." So there's, living waters here that are taking place. Verse 9, very significant here, it indicates, "And the Lord will be king over all the earth. And in that day the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one." Notice here, it's, "And the Lord will be king over the earth." It seems to me you have his coming, or just to even be more specific, siege of Jerusalem. coming of the Lord, cosmic signs, geological changes, and then it indicates that the Lord will be king over all the earth. So it seems like he returns to earth as he's dealing with his enemies, he's rescuing Israel, and then his kingdom is established. This is a pattern I think you see throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. Tribulation, distress for Israel. It's a time of Jacob's distress, but he will be saved from it. So there ends up being a rescue and then an earthly kingdom. Then it talks about other changes that will take place. All the land will be changed, and it gives you details of that in verse 10. Verse 11 is interesting. It talks about people will live in it, and there will be no more curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in security. So it's talking about better conditions. It's talking about Jerusalem dwelling in security. So these are drastically better times. But then in verse 12 it says, now this will be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples who have gone to war against Jerusalem. So notice here, he's dealing with the enemies of Jerusalem here. Their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongue will rot in their mouth. It will come about in that day that a great panic from the Lord will fall on them, and they will seize one another's hand, and the hand of one will be lifted against the hand of another. Judah also will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations will be gathered, gold and silver and garments in great abundance. So also, like this plague, will be the plague on the horse, the mule, the camel, the donkey, and all the cattle that will be in those camps. Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, to celebrate the Feast of Booths. So you see here, after this time period, those who are survivors, they will, go up year to year to Jerusalem. Verse 17, and it will be that whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. Now what's interesting about that is that indicates that during this time period that it's possible for some groups or families or nations to not be doing what they're supposed to be doing. And notice it indicates that there's consequences here. There will be no rain on them. And then you get an example. If the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. And then verse 19, this will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. So indicates here that there could be nations that, if they were to not do what they were supposed to do, that there could be consequences here. There could be punishment, there could be famine, those sorts of things. Again, you should be asking yourself, where does this fit when it comes to, events that the Bible's talking about? Verse 20 says, in that day there will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, holy to the Lord, and the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the bowls before the altar. So everything is going to be holy and devoted to the Lord at that time. So the reason why I think this passage has particular relevance to the millennium is because I think it's describing events that to our standpoint now have not occurred. I don't think that you can go to any event in history up to this standpoint and say, okay, Zechariah 14 is the fulfillment of that. If you hold to a preterist view, you would say that's true. You would say that this was fulfilled in AD 70. But this clearly wasn't fulfilled in AD 70. AD 70, we did not see the Lord go fight against the nations. First of all, it was Rome. This is talking about the nations coming against them. We don't see the Lord coming against the nations that are coming against Jerusalem. This appears to be a rescue. This appears to be a literal return to the Mount of Olives. There appears to be an earthly kingdom established as a result of the return of the Mount of Olives. So it hasn't been fulfilled up until this point. If you want to do a little, if you want to think through, does this appear to fit the eternal state? I would say no, because I think when you're in the eternal state, there's no sin or rebellion at all. So I think this passage fits nicely with I guess what I would call an intermediate kingdom. So I would see this being consistent with the millennium, but I would see it as indicating also an intermediate kingdom, because when I look at the events here, I don't see them fitting anything that's happened yet. and I don't see it being true of the eternal state. At this particular time, you actually have the Lord return to earth, return to the Mount of Olives, establish a kingdom. But during this particular time, it appears that there could be a nation or a family group or people group that doesn't do what they're supposed to do. But we know that that wouldn't be true of the eternal state either. So I think this is one of the, I don't think this is the only passage, but I think this is one of these passages that's indicating some sort of intermediate kingdom. All right, any thoughts on Zechariah 14? We'll be making our way now back to Revelation 20. One of the reasons why I wanted to point that passage out is we don't go for the idea that the idea of premillennialism is just a one text passage. Revelation 20 tells us the time, how long the intermediate kingdom is, but there's other passages that seem to be referring to a time period different from our present age, but also different in some ways from the eternal state. Okay, so we're in Revelation 20. I think last time we left off, I think we finished with pages 186 and 187, where we're doing a basic introduction of what amillennialism, postmillennialism, and premillennialism is. We read the first verses of Revelation 20, I think the first 10 verses. Seems to be the case that what's being described when you look at Revelation 19 and 20 is that you end up having Christ return. I think all evangelicals are agreeing that Revelation 19 is describing, this, or most of them would agree, that Revelation 19 is describing the second coming of Christ. Revelation 20 seems to follow on the heels of that. It talks about a binding of Satan and the reign of the saints, and then after the 1,000 years are completed, Satan is released and there's a rebellion that's immediately dealt with. It seems to be the case that if you're reading this passage that there's some sort of 1,000-year kingdom that follows the second coming but is before the eternal state. And I think that is the case. It seems like the burden of proof is much more on those who are going to argue that this passage isn't teaching what it appears to be teaching. Now on page 188, I mentioned various arguments for the view, what we would call the premillennial view, that Christ comes first, and then there's a millennial kingdom, so his coming is pre-millennium. There's various arguments, and some of these I spend more time on than others, but and some of these arguments are in regard to some of the criticisms that have been made against the premillennial view. But one of the things I want to lead off here is one thing that oftentimes is viewed as a weakness for the premillennial view, but I actually think it's a strength, which is the whole issue of the genre. When you get into debates over the millennium, one of the first things that comes up is, Book of Revelation, that's apocalyptic genre, don't take it too literally. That sort of argument almost seems to be somewhat of a default sort of position where, if the non-millennial views are having difficulty dealing with the exegesis of the passage, to fall back to the, it's apocalyptic literature, therefore it's hard to understand. I've even read major proponents of other millennial views say they wish they didn't even have to deal with Revelation, and wish we could just stick with other text. But Revelation is part of the scripture. I also find it ironic that sometimes from the crowd that's telling us that we need to be using New Testament priority over the Old to come to our theological conclusions, that when we come to the last book of the New Testament, sometimes we're told, don't start there, don't develop your view of the kingdom, based on Revelation 20, use other passages to interpret it. I find that somewhat ironic because this is a New Testament passage, it's a New Testament book, the last book of the New Testament. It's explicitly telling us, that's giving details about what's to come. So we need to take it seriously. So, what mentioned here is with the genre, the passage discussing the millennial kingdom, Revelation 20, occurs within a book in which the stated genre of the book is prophecy. So, if you look in Revelation 1:3, it says, Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near. So it's specifically telling us that it's prophecy. If you were to look at those other references too, I'm not going to read all those, but you'll see references to this being a prophecy in the other verses that are mentioned here. So we're told explicitly that it's prophecy. We also see with point A here, the purpose of the book is to reveal prophetic events, the things that are to come. Notice also with point B that the book invites the reader to read and be blessed by its contents. There are no, and that should be warnings, but there are no warnings that this book is too hard to understand or that one should start with other Bible passages to interpret it. There's a blessing pronounced upon those who read it and heed it. We're not getting qualifications that, okay, this is going to be really hard, you're not going to understand it. Don't take it too seriously, don't be too literal with it. See, Revelation, yes, sometimes uses symbols, but there are literal meanings behind each symbol. Sometimes the meaning of these symbols is given, sometimes it is not, but in all cases there is a literal meaning behind the symbols. So we're not claiming here that the book of Revelation is always easy to understand. There's obviously difficult parts to it, but we don't want to default either to because some of it's difficult or because some of the symbols aren't explained. We're just going to throw our hands up in the air and not make any conclusions based on it. So I think we need to take seriously that it is a prophecy. Literary structure. The discussion of a millennium comes within the literary section of Revelation 19:11 to 21:8 that describes chronological events after the return of Jesus Christ. While many argue that the book of Revelation is hard to interpret, there is general agreement on the literary structure of the book, which you can see up here is, there's several sections. There's a prologue, there's the letters to the 7 churches, there's the heavenly court scene in that section here mentioned here. Apocalyptic narrative, chapters 12 through 16. The section in particular where the millennium is mentioned is Revelation 19:11 through 21:8. Revelation 19 to 21:8 is a section within the book of Revelation, and within this section, John uses the kaidon expression, which can be translated as "and I saw" or "then I saw." It's used 8 times in 19:11. 19:17, verse 19, chapter 20, verses 1, 4, 11, 12, and then 21:1. This expression indicates chronological progression, which seems to be the case here. As the events of this section unfold, John tells us several things he saw in succession, one after another. In 19 verses 11 to 16, he sees the return of Christ with the armies of heaven to strike down Christ's enemies and for Christ to rule the nations. In verses 17 to 18, then John sees an angel in heaven calling to the birds to eat the flesh of the enemies of Christ. In verses 19 to 21, John sees the beast and his armies of the earth waging war against Christ, and then they're defeated by the return of Christ. And you get to chapter 20. It seems like the chronology is continuing. Then John sees an angel coming from heaven with a great chain to bind Satan and then throw him into the pit. Next, in verses 4 to 10, John sees thrones established and the resurrection of the martyrs, and they're reigning with Christ for 1,000 years, and the rest of the dead coming to life after the 1,000 years are completed. In verse 11, then John saw a great white throne established that could not be escaped. And then in verses 12 to 15, John saw the great and the small judged, with those whose names were not found in the book of life being cast into the lake of fire. Death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. And then 21, 1 to 8, John saw a new heaven and a new earth and the coming of the new Jerusalem. The main point here, as I mentioned, is that in this section of Revelation 19, 11 through 21:8, John is describing the second coming of Jesus and the events that follow it. This includes the 1,000-year reign of Christ of Revelation 20, 1 to 10. As Blazing is correct when he observes, quote, "It is noteworthy that when the issue of theological historical significance is suspended and the question is strictly literary, there is a general agreement that the events in the visions of 19:11 to 21:8 are correlative with or consequent to the parousia, or the coming in 1911. Okay, another issue, the third thing that I think supports the premillennial understanding, which would be is the binding of Satan and the complete cessation of Satan's activities. So, you get into the whole issue of what it means for Satan to be bound. So when you look at Revelation 20, it indicates what appears to be at this time of the second coming. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. So notice here it's talking about a binding of Satan. And then it says in verse 3, and he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. And then after these things, he must be released for a short time. So now remember, with to compare with the millennial views on this, both the amillennialist and the postmillennialist will be saying what's being described in Revelation 21-3 with the binding of Satan is taking place in this present age. So remember, with the amillennial and postmillennial view, the millennium takes place between the two comings of Christ. Thus, it's the second coming of Christ that brings an end to the millennium. But if that ends up being the case, then you must have this binding that is taking place occurring today. So according to the amillennialist and the postmillennialist, Revelation 21-3 is being fulfilled today. If that is to be the case, they must be correct that the second coming that is described in Revelation 19 actually occurs at let's just put it this way. They're going to argue you have recapitulation. That Revelation 19 takes you through the second coming, but with Revelation 20, it kicks you back to the church age. So this is one of these issues between a chronological reading. A premillennialist would say, no, there's progression here. The binding of Satan follows the return of Christ. Those who are not premillennial would say that there's a recapitulation here, that you have the second coming, but then with Revelation 20, it kicks you back to the beginning of the church age and describes the whole inter-Advent age. Now, in regard to this, I believe this is a real strength of the premillennial view, because I think the answer is what appears to be the case, that you have a binding of Satan that is after the second coming of Christ. One of the points that I make here is that both Scripture and experience tell us that Satan and his deceiving abilities in regard to the nations are very strong in this present evil age in between the two comings of Jesus. Even within the book of Revelation itself, it's telling you that Satan is involved with deception, with deceiving the nations. One thing that you should understand with the amillennial, postmillennial understanding is this is one of the differences. The premillennialist is going to argue that Satan himself is bound, and as a result, his activity of deceiving the nations ceases during this period. The other millennial views will argue that the binding of Satan is mostly in regard to curtailing a certain function that he has, which is deception. So you're going to when you look at this text, is it the case that Satan himself is bound as an entity, or is it just indicating that his ability to deceive the nations is curtailed? I think the evidence is more in regard to him as a person being incarcerated at this time. But I would actually see this as being a real problem for the other views, because the book of Revelation itself indicates that before the second coming of Christ, Satan is involved with deceiving. If you look at Revelation 13, it says, and the dragon Satan gave him, the beast, his power and his throne and great authority, and it was given to him, the beast, to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. All who dwell on the earth will worship him. So if you note here, the book of Revelation states that before Jesus comes, Satan is characterized by deceiving every people group. Revelation 12:9 says, and the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. So note here, Revelation presents Satan's activity before the return of Jesus as that of deceiving the whole world. And then there's other passages where, I think these Revelation ones are particularly significant, because within the book of Revelation itself, it's telling you before the return of Christ that there's such deceptive activity that's taking place. But then there's other scriptures, 2 Corinthians 4:4, And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, so that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. 1 Peter 5:8, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. 1 John 5:19, the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. So as I read those verses, that doesn't seem to be consistent with a present understanding of the binding of Satan. So thus, with Revelation 20:1-3, it states that Jesus' second coming to earth, Satan will be bound and thrown into the pit where his activities come to a complete cessation. So this has not occurred yet in history. The acts of binding, throwing, shutting, and sealing that you see in Revelation 20 indicates that Satan's activities are completely finished. As the commentator Mounce stated, the elaborate measures taken to ensure his custody, Satan's, are most easily understood as implying the complete cessation of his influence on earth rather than just a curbing of his activities. And so I give a little bit of an example here. Again, this example goes back to the whole issue of, is it just an activity of Satan that's curtailed, or is he as a person incarcerated? And as a result, he's not able to do anything. I think it's that. For example, if a serial killer who also robbed and raped from people in a city was captured and thrown into prison so that his murderous ways are no more, we would not conclude that his murderous ways have been curtailed but not ceased, nor would we conclude that he was still able to rob and steal. His bodily incarceration means that his activities have also ceased. Likewise, it is not just an activity of Satan that is lessened with Revelation 20. Satan himself is confined during this 1,000-year period. And notice, that it mentions here, in Revelation 20, that he's, it's when you read it here, it says here, he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil, and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the abyss. So he's actually thrown into the abyss. In an earlier part of Revelation, you actually see demons that are unlocked from the abyss to do their destruction upon the earth, which would seem to indicate that before they were let free, they weren't able to do things that were on the earth. So I think that's proof of more of a premillennial understanding. We'll also mention here, too, that in regard to the false trinity, the point that, let me just read this here. As the beast and the false prophet are defeated in 19:19-21, it seems natural to think that the power behind this false trinity, Satan, will be defeated at this time as well. And so what we're just arguing here is a harmony of being dealt with, the false trinity being dealt with here. In Revelation 19, when it's talking about the time of the Christ's return, it says, I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat on his horse. And then it tells you here in verse 20 that, and the beast was seized with him and the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark. And it says that they were thrown into the lake of fire. So notice here you end up having the beast and the false prophet, and then you end up having the power behind the beast and the false prophet, Satan, dealt with at that particular time. So I think you have all members of the false trinity that are dealt with. All right, any questions on any of that so far? All right, let's move on to the whole issue of the two physical resurrections. When it comes to the two physical resurrections, this is an important thing to think through. Revelation 20 verses 4-5 says, Then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. So it talks about certain people receiving thrones. Judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand, and they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. So now when it talks about this group here, when it says, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God. Go back to Revelation 6, and you'll see who this group is. Revelation 6, verse 9. Revelation 6:9 says, when the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. And then they cried out with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And there was given to each of them a white robe, and they were told that they should wait a little while longer, until others, the number of those who were to be killed would be completed. So I think this is the group that's being talked about. So notice in Revelation 6 that these are martyrs these are people giving their life for the cause of Christ. I think we could agree that they're Christians, right? You wouldn't be a martyr for the cause of Christ if you didn't know the Lord. And it indicates that in verse 9 that their souls, I saw underneath the altar, the souls of those who had been slain. I mean, the bodily resurrection hasn't taken place yet, but there's still that intermediate existence. So these souls find themselves in heaven. So these people that were saved on the earth were killed because of their testimony for Christ, and their souls are in heaven. So when you come back to Revelation 20, it says in verse 4, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of the testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand, and they came to life. That seems to be pretty straightforward, that those who gave their life for Christ, even though their souls were in heaven, now they're coming to life. They're having physical resurrection. These appear to be believers who were killed on earth, whose souls were in heaven, and at this time, following the second coming, they receive a bodily resurrection. They came to life. If you look in Revelation 2:8, notice when Jesus is speaking to the church at Smyrna, it says, and to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the first and the last, this is Jesus, who was dead and has come to life. Same term there. Jesus can refer to himself as one who has come to life. That's not a statement that he's regenerated or became born again. Jesus didn't need to be saved, but he did need to be raised from the dead because he was killed physically and there was a physical resurrection. So, now what's significant about that is that I think the evidence is pretty strong when you look at it contextually here, that this coming to life is a physical resurrection of those who have been physically killed for the cause of Christ. Most who don't hold the premillennial view will say that the came to life here refers to spiritual resurrection. Or some will say there's not total 100% unanimity on how to understand this verse, but a large number of the non-premillennial views will argue that this is regeneration, that this is salvation, which to me totally goes against the context. And then you notice in verse, it talks about after that they came to life and they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years, which seems to make sense that the kingdom reign, the reign of the saints, takes place in connection with the reign of the Messiah upon the earth and the resurrection that takes place. And then in verse 5 it mentions the rest of the dead did not come to life. Notice the rest of the dead. So this is another group. So I take it believers have been raised by this point, but the rest of the dead did not come to life. So you have Ezeson again, just like you did in verse 4. Did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. There seems to be general agreement amongst all sides that the coming to life in verse 5 is a physical resurrection. Even most amillennialists and postmillennialists acknowledge that the second resurrection is a physical resurrection. But this is one of the problems of the non-premillennial views, is they're asking you to take the first came to life as a spiritual resurrection and the second coming to life as a physical resurrection. The premillennial view is asking you to take both of the coming to lives as physical resurrection. First is going to be for the believers at the time immediately following, at the time of the second coming, and then the rest of the dead, being unbelievers with the physical resurrection for punishment, coming to life at the end of the second period. So I think this is pretty strong evidence here, because if in order to hold to a non-premillennial view, you would have to take came to life in different senses in a very, very strict a very, very close context. And not only that, when it talks about these people in verse 4 coming to life, to just try to make that, well, that's spiritual resurrection, that's regeneration. The context of that is a people group that we already saw from chapter 6 had been physically killed because of their testimony for Christ. Those martyrs in Revelation 6 were already believers. So, John, I see your hand.
I was just wondering, how many martyrs? I mean, is this like all the martyrs? And then is verse 5 the rest of the dead? Are those martyrs also, but martyrs from a later context, or are those non-martyrs that were Christians that died?
No, well, I would say, just to work through it, in verse 4, I do think that the ones that come to life here are specifically mentioned as the martyr. In this, well, let me just go through. In verse 4, it says, I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. I think that's a broader statement. I think that's a broader statement than just beyond the martyrs. So I think that it could include believers of all ages up until that point.
And then the souls of those who have been beheaded are like first century martyrs, or?
I would say those are tribulation martyrs. Okay. Those are the ones that are a result of the fifth seal. Okay. Which again is you're getting into a bigger issue here of a futuristic understanding of the day of the Lord in the Daniel 70th week. But because Revelation 6 is placing it in the context of the seals, I think this group is specifically the martyrs of the tribulation period.
And then is this like a reward for them that they get to be resurrected first and reign with Christ? Should we look at it that way? Like, is this some special?
It's not a special. I mean, I would say, because I think the second coming to life is going to be for the dead. I mean, for the unbelievers. So, what I think is, I think the beginning of verse 4 is more general, and then there's a specific group, the martyrs of the tribulation period, who are discussed. So there's a sense in which they're both, I would say they're both resurrected and reigning, but there's special attention given in verse 4 to those that died during this particular period. Yeah, Steve.
Just kind of a dark spot in my own understanding. For example, the sheep and goat judgment, where the sheep who have survived the tribulation, who are judged to be believers, and who survive into the millennial kingdom. I don't have a lot of clarity on what happens to them. I know from Isaiah 65 that it's a shame if somebody dies at 100, so indicating that they're still dead. But I don't know where I fit in their death or resurrection and all that into that scheme that they're
talking about, like the sheep specifically of the Matthew 25.
Yeah.
In regard specifically to their, like, what's their destiny after they enter into the kingdom? Like,
right.
When do they?
They're entering in still in unglorified bodies. Mm-hmm. I would assume that they're going to die at some point. So I don't know where I plug their resurrection in.
Yeah. I would plug it into 1 Corinthians 15. I think that they get. I do think that they get glorified bodies going into the eternal state. So, like, if you look at 1 Corinthians 15. When you're getting the order of the resurrection program. By the way, I'm hoping on the last day to get more into the judgment resurrection. So, if I'm brief here, I hope to do more a week from today on that issue. But in 1 Corinthians 15, where he's given the order of the resurrection program, it says, But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. For since by a man came death, by a man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive. So he's talking about resurrection explicitly. But then he says, but each in his own order. So now he's going to talk about the order of the resurrection, of which I think it's implied that there's gaps between these. Because if you're going to have an order of things, there's usually time period between things. Then it says in verse 23, but each in his own order, Christ the first fruits, after that, those who are Christed is coming. So, has there been a gap there, I would say yes. Christ the first fruits. And you may even throw in the in Matthew 27, the saints, the ones that came out of the tombs, they may have been part of that stage too. And then you have, after that, those are Christ that is coming. I mean, everybody's going to admit that there's a gap of time there. Verse 24, then, I think this is the third stage. Then comes the end, when he hands over the kingdom to God and Father, when he has abolished all rule and all authority, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. So there's a third stage to that after the actual millennial Davidic reign of Christ upon the earth. So I think to answer your question, I think it comes at the end of the millennium. And I also think that has to be the case too, because it says in 1 Corinthians 15:50, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, which I think has to have indication there for the final eternal state. So hopefully we can get more into that on next Tuesday on the because we do need to cover some on the judgments and the resurrection. Is there another hand? I saw Renee. Go ahead.
So because of this first resurrection that came to life, it appears to only be referring to tribulationist saints who were killed. The way we, the church, get into this reign with Christ, is that why you would hold to a pre-tribulational rapture?
Yeah, well, I would say the thing is, I do think verse 4, it says, I saw thrones and they sat on them and judgment was given to them. I think that's broader than just the tribulation saint.
You have to have a pre-tribulational rapture to be, because it doesn't, I mean, at this point, and if you didn't believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, the church, the souls are with Christ, but the bodies are still in the grave.
I would say, I actually think at this point, the timing of the rapture issue isn't primary in regard to what we're talking about here. So in other words, I'm not seeing much of a difference.
How would like if I was to die, how would I get here with Christ then if I didn't hold to a pre-tribulational rapture?
Well, you could believe that 1 Thessalonians 4 rapture takes place at the time of the second coming. So you could, I mean, so if you're post-trib, you would end up holding that.
But isn't that what we're talking about? You're just saying then that John didn't address.
I'm just making the point that in connection with the second coming, there's a first resurrection, which includes believers. When I broaden it out when I start to look at it in regard to specific people groups, my view would be is that in connection with the first coming, of which I would consider as a pre-trib guide that to be also a part of the first coming and the first resurrection, I would say that even there could be stages. There could be a translation and a resurrection of church saints, but also at the time of the second coming, Old Testament saints are raised from the ground, Daniel 2. The martyred saints are resurrected. So I actually think when you bring other passages into it, you're seeing those groups all coming together at this time. But I would say that the church, Old Testament saints, martyred saints during the tribulation, they're all glorified. I wouldn't see any believers not glorified at this point that had died.
It doesn't include those other ones. Right.
When you say does not include the other,
it only includes the ones who were beheaded for their testimony.
I would say that it would be church saints that are part of the rapture, Old Testament saints that had died or martyred tribulation. The ones that I do think Matthew 25 is indicating that those who are alive at the time of the second coming would enter it in their non-glorified bodies, which is going to be which their children will be the nucleus for the rebellion that comes later. Yeah.
They came to life.
Yeah.
That's not the church there at all.
When it says they came to life, I think it's in specific reference to these martyrs here. Yeah.
So sometime prior, if we're going to be there on the throne ruling, we would have to come to life.
Yeah,
prior.
I think the first S4 would be at the rapture. And when I read Revelation 19, I'm not seeing a meeting in the air that you see in 1 Thess 4. So I actually think there's a distinction there. Okay. Yeah, Ben.
You might have gone over this, but maybe I just missed it. Could you discuss in verse 5 why it says this is the first resurrection as opposed to, because there's two resurrections, one which happens before the 1,000 years, one which happens after. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't we call the first one the first resurrection and say this is the second?
Yeah, because I think he's referring back to, because the fact that it is talking about, I would just say contextually, It says in verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. Then I think he's making a summary statement about the first resurrection. Part of the reason I think that has to be the case is because he's clearly making a distinction between the two. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second, has no power. I would admit the way that it comes chronologically, it seems almost a little out of order, but I think he's emphasizing the first resurrection.
First resurrection goes back to verse 4.
Yeah, I think it's giving a summation of that, right? Because it talks about the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years. It's almost he's emphasizing the first resurrection and making a statement about the second that is to come. But as he makes that, then he makes a summary statement about the first resurrection. Right. Okay. Yep, Frank.
When he says second death, is he referring to the death that'll happen in the future, or is he referring to the second death of like the physical
I think the great white throne judgment.
Okay.
In 11, the final judgment, right? Okay, so to come back to this here, I think I've kind of already talked. I won't necessarily read through all of this that's mentioned here, but the main thing to get here is, as you're working through a millennial issue, you need to work through this, what these coming to life means. I mean, if you're taking both of them to be referring to bodily resurrection, you're going to be premillennial because bodily resurrection hasn't occurred yet. If you're going to take a non-premillennial view, you're going to have to argue that the came to life of verse 4 is a spiritual resurrection, while immediately after that the same term is used of a physical resurrection. Okay, all right, let's go on to page 191. Kind of give a little if then sort of scenario here. If Revelation 24-5 is referring to a physical resurrection of Christian martyrs, which is highly likely, then this physical resurrection must follow the second coming of Jesus, since this resurrection has not occurred yet. And if 1,000 years separates the first bodily resurrection from the second bodily resurrection, then the 1,000-year period must also be after the second coming of Christ. So I think the text and the logic there are indicating a gap. Number 5, another argument would be is that during his earthly ministry, Jesus placed his kingdom reign in connection with his second coming to earth. I find these passages to be very powerful. I know we've talked about them before, because to me, this is the best evidence possible. Jesus explicitly talking about the future and telling you when his reign is going to occur. So Jesus says in Matthew 19:28, Jesus said, "And truly I say to you that you have followed me in the regeneration," in the cosmic renewal, "when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne. You also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So this is definitely a prophetic context in the regeneration. Notice it's in the regeneration when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne. I think that's a reference to the Davidic throne. At that time, the apostles will be judging the 12 tribes of Israel. I don't see any of these three things as having occurred yet. I don't see the renewal of the cosmos, the Son of Man sitting on his glorious throne, the Davidic throne, or the 12 apostles ruling over the 12 tribes of Israel as having occurred yet. That's a futuristic context. And then Matthew 25:31-33, "But when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne." So think of that. When the Son of Man comes in glory, has that occurred yet? Say no, that's still future. That's what the angels promised in Acts 1, that will occur. All the angels with him, has that occurred? I'd say no. But when those things occurs, then he will sit on his glorious throne. So Jesus doesn't say, he's coming to finish his Davidic reign. That's already been occurring, but it's that time he sits on it. And notice what happens at the time. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. So it's his coming, then his throne, his reign, then the judgment that takes place. Go ahead, Trenway.
Just to make sure I understand, the 12 apostles will sit on 12 thrones and judge the 12 tribes of Israel, and then Israel it's almost like a cascading effect. They have a mediatorial role to the other nations.
Right.
And so the apostles aren't judging necessarily all the nations, just Israel, who then has kind of some sort of authority over the other nations.
Yeah. And I would say is because Israel at that particular time has a specific mediatory role of leadership and service, that there is a sense in which has global implications, but it's primarily because Israel is going to end up being the leader nation. That's what Isaiah 2:2-4 explicitly states. There's going to be a streaming into Jerusalem to learn the ways of Israel's God. So the correct answer would be is it's a direct role over Israel, but because Israel's the leading nation, the leaders of the leading nation also have, it would be global.
And would the other nations kind of be ruled over by glorified saints in the church age?
I think so, yeah. So that's why I think Revelation 2:26-27, because it's a promise to the church. So you're going to rule. Remember, as Christ rules, he also allows those who are his to be a part of the rule. So you see that often. Whatever Christ is the ultimate of, he usually grants it to others. He's ultimate priest, but we're a priesthood. He's ultimate king, but we're kings. He's ultimate servant, but we're servants. So those sorts of things you see play out. So now this is a little bit of my speculation, sanctified speculation, but because there are global geopolitical nations after the second return of Christ, it would seem to me to make sense that probably those that are Gentile probably would have more ruling authority over Gentile areas. But I'm not going to die on that hill. It's just, it would seem to me that perhaps would be the case. Okay, number 6. The Old Testament told of a kingdom reign of the Messiah over the earth after a period of intense tribulation. I already read for you Zechariah 14. Remember that? Siege of Jerusalem. Things look bleak. The Lord fights those nations, returns to the Mount of Olives with changes to the area, and then he establishes his kingdom upon the earth. So it seems like there is a tribulation that precedes kingdom. I just want to make a point even before we get to Isaiah 24. Again, this is within the broader point of Old Testament and New Testament indicates unique time of global tribulation followed by kingdom. So in Isaiah 13 to 23, you have, like in my study Bible here, it mentions the denunciations against other nations. So 13 and 14 talks about Babylon, and then you get all the other mentions of Philistia and Moab and others. It sets the scene when you get to 24 and 25 because the nations are what's being discussed in 13 to 23, those chapters of Isaiah. But then when you hit Isaiah 24, many will call Isaiah 24 to 27 Isaiah's little apocalypse. And Revelation really has a lot in common with Isaiah 24 to 27. But when you get to Isaiah 24, it says, "Behold, the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates it, distorts its surface, and scatters its inhabitants." This is the day of the Lord. And as I've argued before, yes, in this world you will have tribulation, and there are a lot of negative things, very serious negative things and persecution that take place. But there is a unique day of the Lord that is coming. And so it's that unique day of the Lord tribulation that precedes the kingdom. But notice in verse 3, it says, "The earth will be completely laid waste and completely despoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word." Verse 5 says, "The earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant." I mean, man is a sinner. He has not carried out the dominion mandate that he was supposed to from creation and being an image bearer. Verse 6 says, "Therefore a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men are left." So you get if you read the whole chapter, you see this incredible time of tribulation. Verse 19 says, "The earth is broken asunder, the earth is split through, the earth is shaken violently, the earth reels to and fro like a drunkard, and it totters like a shack." Man, that sounds like Revelation when you're reading the book of Revelation with its earthquakes and cosmic signs. Notice it says at the end of verse 20, it will fall never to rise again. So, now notice this is really interesting here. I actually think that this has implications for the intermediate kingdom or the millennium. Verse 21 says, "So it will happen in that day that the Lord will" what? He will punish the host of heaven on high. I think that would have reference to evil spiritual beings. Notice, "and the kings of the earth on earth." That sounds like Revelation 19 with the kings of the earth coming against Christ as he's coming again. So notice here, it will happen in that day, the Lord will punish the host of heaven on high and the kings of the earth on earth. And then it says in verse 22, "They will be gathered together like prisoners in the dungeon and will be confined in prison." And notice this, "and after many days they will be punished." Isn't that interesting there? So it's talking about an imprisonment, and then after many days they will be punished. "Then the moon will be abashed and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders." So I think that could have some implications in regard to the staged judgments mentioned in the book of Revelation. And certainly, in regard, remember what we saw with Satan. Christ comes again, he's bound, he's sent to the abyss. 1,000 years later, he's released, destroyed, and then sent to the lake of fire. So in the case of Satan, we can say that there's an incarceration, and then after many days, a punishment. But I want you to, more directly to my point here, is when you get to chapter 25, this is where you have the kingdom. Particularly when you get to verse 6, it says, "The Lord of hosts will prepare a lavish banquet for all peoples on this mountain. A banquet of aged wine, choice pieces with marrow, and refined aged wine." So one of the things I like about that, it indicates there's good food and drink in the when the kingdom comes. Verse 7 says, by the way, I think when you were in Matthew 8, when it's talking about the banquet, the kingdom is presented as a celebration and a banquet, and food is a part of celebration. Verse 7 says, "And on this mountain he will swallow up the covering which is over all peoples, even the veil which is stretched over all nations. He will swallow up death for all time." And so you have these glorious kingdom conditions here. But the thing to notice here is, again, notice the pattern. Revelation 24, worldwide, global, unique judgment. Chapter 25, kingdom. What did you see in Zechariah 14? Siege of Jerusalem, tribulation, return of the Lord, kingdom. And then, when we looked at the Olivet Discourse, not to go over that all over again, but remember in Matthew 24, Matthew 24, you have this tribulation period that's discussed. All these signs, in regard, in Matthew 24, we talked about all those signs of the kingdom. Then we talked about the Lord's return. It says at the Matthew 24:30, "And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. All the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory." And then when you get to Matthew 25:31, it mentions when the Son of Man comes, in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. And then within that here, in Matthew 25:34, when he's judging the nations, remember verse 32 talks about all the nations will be gathered before him. And then in verse 34, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world.'" These are believers going into it, but it's at this time that they're inheriting it in the sense that they get it. So it seems to me you're seeing this, you see this pattern over and over, and I see it in the book of Revelation. Tribulation, and then unique period of tribulation followed by kingdom. Okay, then my last point here on the bottom of page 191. The Old Testament describes conditions associated with an intermediate kingdom that is distinct from the present age and the eternal state. Okay, this is, I mentioned the Isaiah 24 period where you have that gap, you have an incarceration, and then after many days, a final judgment that takes place. The main point that I'm making here is, like I said, there seems to be some passages that indicate conditions that are neither true of the present age or the eternal state. Isaiah 65:20 when it's talking about new heavens, new earth. Isaiah 65:20 says, "No more shall there be in it an infant that lives but a few days, or an old man who does not fill out his days. For the child shall die 100 years old, and the sinner 100 years old shall be thought accursed." So, I mean, again, I have my little chart here that kind of explains this here. What lifespans do we see today? 70, 80 years? Isn't that Psalm 90? I can't remember exactly. Psalm Moses, where he talks about, pretty much that same time period. Let's just put it this way. This is talking about if somebody dies at the age of 100, they'll be thought accursed. Is that true today? Do we look at centenarians? Is that what you call the people that are 100? People that make it to 100, and then when they die, we say, "What'd you do wrong? You must have really messed up for you to die at the age of 100 because you were just a spring chicken." We view that as long life. We have a big deal when people celebrate their 90th birthday or their 100th birthday. I was recently, 2 months ago, at a dear friend, this lady, a friend of ours, who had her 90th birthday party, and she ended up having a couple friends that were around her age, and there was another lady who had just celebrated her 90th birthday. And you know how women are with their they don't like telling their age, but when you get to that point, it's proud. I remember sitting next to her, introducing myself. She goes, "I just had my 90th birthday." Kind of like you never find a 43-year-old. They say, "Hey, I just had my 43-year-old birthday," or "Hey, I just turned 52." But when it's 90, it's a big deal. And so it was funny. Just the other ladies that were around her age, they would as soon as you got their name, they'd say their age. So it's a big deal. Making it to 90 or 100 is a big deal. So, but how about in the eternal state? Nobody's dying at all. Nobody dies when you're in the eternal state. But here you have a case where people, if they die at the age of 100, will be thought accursed. So, I think this indicates a time period where longevity of life is greatly increased, but there's still some presence of death that could take place. I would think, based on this, if someone dies at the age of 100, that would be because they've done something wrong and a punishment. How that all works out, in the details, it's hard to know, but it seems to indicate some sort of distinction in time. Well, we talked about Zechariah 14 earlier. Remember in the Zechariah 14 passage, if the nations, and to use an example, Egypt in Zechariah 14, if they don't do what they're supposed to do, there's a plague, there can be drought or famine, those sorts of things. It's during a time period where the Lord is reigning on the earth, Zechariah 14, I think either verse 5 or verse 9. So, notice during the present age, Jesus is in heaven and the nations do not yet submit to Jesus as king. If you doubt that, just think of some of the countries in the Middle East and others. Ask them if they're serving the King of Kings right now. Now, we know they're under his sovereignty, so I'm not denying that. God's will is being done. But as far as the direct reign on the earth, that is still to come. Millennial kingdom, Jesus rules the nations on earth and punishes those nations that do not act as they should. But in the eternal state, the nations will act exactly as they should with no need of punishment. So I think Zechariah 14, I would even include Zechariah 8, where it's talking about old men and women in the streets while the children are playing, which indicating being elderly. I think that indicates an intermediate period. By the way, you want to know who's really good on that argument? If you... This particular argument, I don't want to make it sound like he invented it, but I think the one who articulates it the best is actually Wayne Grudem. Wayne Grudem's not a dispensational premillennialist. He's a historic premillennialist, and he's also, I think, holds to covenant theology. But as he defends premillennialism and systematic theology, he really articulates this point well. So this isn't just a dispensational argument. And then lastly, not as important, but I do think church history is a powerful argument for the truth of premillennialism. There seemed to be, you get in debate whether it was unanimous or consensus or whatever, but there was a lot of key people, including those that knew the Apostle John, who were premillennial. So, church history in the first couple hundred years of church history, there's many premillennialists, which I think is more of an intuitive understanding based on what Revelation 20 appears to say. I think most of the arguments against premillennialism are more on what doesn't appear to be likely or plausible than mere refutations of premillennial passages. doesn't seem right that you would have glorified and non-glorified at the same time living on earth. It doesn't seem right that after Jesus returns that there could be anybody that would sin. It doesn't seem right that there could be a rebellion of Satan after the 1,000-year period. Now, those are legitimate issues to bring up, but I think those are more in the realm of what people think, what they think it's going to be like, as opposed to what the Scripture is actually saying. Seems to me God's kingdom program has many phases throughout history. I think there's a phase of it at creation, when man's given the mandate to rule the earth. There's a phase of it once the fall takes place, where you have the promise of the coming one who will remove the curse with Genesis 3:15. I think you see a phase of it with the growth of Israel as a nation when you get to Exodus and they get their constitution with the Mosaic Law. That's a phase. And of course, when they conquer the land, and then when they become a theocracy, there's actually a theocracy in Israel with kings. That ends up being a phase of the program. I think in the church, there's a phase, although I don't think the kingdom is established, there's a phase of the kingdom program taken today as the Messiah has come, the King has come, his message of the gospel, and in order to be believed, in order to enter the kingdom. We're sons of the kingdom today. We're to exhibit kingdom righteousness in our life. We're proclaiming the gospel that qualifies one to be a part of the kingdom. That's a part of the kingdom phase. I think the millennial phase, as we talked about earlier, that ends up being a phase in history where the Messiah rules directly on this earth, even including those that eventually may be his enemies, and he rules them, with a rod of iron. So that's part of the Psalm 2 reign. That's part of the promise to those that will reign with Christ. Revelation 2:26-27, going to rule with a rod of iron, even over those that may be his enemies. And then after that, according to 1 Corinthians 15, he's going to hand the kingdom over to God the Father, and then we go into the eternal state. So I think the millennium is one of those phases of the kingdom program. Yep.
Is that the outline for your book coming up?
Let's just say my book includes that, but it is broader than that. By the way, I did send in my proposal yesterday for my book. It's up to 200. I have to talk about it now. No, it's up to 290 pages and about 30 chapters that are altogether roughly about like 11 or ends up being roughly about 10 pages a piece or so. Go ahead. What were we going to say? Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, we'll cover the areas where I'm trying to make a unique contribution is showing all the phase. Yeah. So I start in Genesis. I have like a 15-page chapter just on Genesis 1-11 to try to fill in a gap that I think sometimes has been a weakness with the dispensational understanding. A lot of times the dispensational understanding of the kingdom starts at Genesis 12. It starts in Genesis 1. There's a lot about the kingdom in Genesis 1. But then I also try to give a fair amount of justice to the eternal kingdom. I think sometimes dispensationalists they've killed a lot of trees in discussing the millennium, but then have very, very little on the eternal state. So I'm trying to actually have a real good discussion of the eternal kingdom. Yep.
Do we get a free copy of the book?
Well, if I can, I will. I know that sometimes you get there's times where I've had something published where I got one copy for myself, and another times I've gotten 20. So when I self-publish stuff, it's more apt to say it again.
On our reading list.
Let's just say if you're when the time it's coming out, if you're diligent, we may be able to work something out. I can't promise a grand giveaway, but if somebody's, let's just say for those that were really, really interested in has the church replaced Israel, and sometimes I'll have a few left in the garage, and can get somebody one of those. Okay.
The Isaiah 24 passage you read, it talked about that not many days or after many days they will be punished.
Yeah.
Are we going to talk in this class about, we're talking a lot about the believer and their destiny as well. What about the unbeliever? I mean, I've always grown up, an unbeliever goes to hell, which I still believe, but does that happen immediately, or does it appear that the great white throne of judgment is like they're in some kind of state now, waiting for that time, then they'll get thrown in hell? Because it seems like that's what's happened to these kings that rebel.
Yeah.
But is that true of believers today, or unbelievers today, or is that something we're going to discuss or no?
I'm hoping that we get to that a week from today, as we go through like a chronology I think when people die today, they go to Hades. But I don't think Hades is the final destination point. I think the lake of fire. So I think, although I think there ends up being some exception because you do have the introduction of the lake of fire with the beast and the false prophet. Because it said in Revelation 19, the beast and the false prophet are thrown in the lake of fire at the time of the second coming, but Satan goes to the abyss. And then it mentions 1,000 years later, he goes to the lake of fire. So I think you get some of those sorts of things in there. But I think in general, Hades is not the lake of fire, although it's also, I'd consider it a temporary place of torment for the. I think there's a parallel in that we could see, like we would say with the intermediate state of the believer is the third heaven, but that's not the new earth, that's not the final destiny. I think there's a parallel with the unbeliever. I think there's a temporary place of torment before even their bodily resurrection called Hades, but I think in the end, they're even raised bodily for the lake of fire. All right, we're not done discussing the millennial issue, but mostly what I tried to do there was a positive presentation of the premillennial view. Any thoughts? I do have a section on 195 and following where I guess particularly when you get to page 198, I do a more specific critique of the amillennial understanding, particularly of Revelation 20. I think a lot of the things that I cover in there I've already discussed them, so I'm not going to go into. I just put it this way: I think the best case for premillennialism is a positive case for premillennialism. Because I think as you work through what appears to be the case, the whole day of the Lord tribulation, and then kingdom follows the return of the Lord. Those sorts of things, I think it becomes pretty clear that the kingdom comes after the return of Christ. All right, any thoughts on millennial issues? Yep.
Just so with the judgment, right, with Christ coming, the sheep and the goats, and he judges them, and then, or sets up his kingdom and judges them, and then millennium begins. Or that's at the beginning of the millennium, he says to them to depart into the eternal fire and eternal punishment. So that's still Hades, right? Like the rich man and Lazarus, that he's still in a flame in a place of torment, but that's not the lake of fire, right? Is that how you see that passage?
Yeah, well, we'll go through that, and whatever. But I think that one gets a little bit tougher. I mean, the fact that you do know that the beast and the false prophet have been thrown in. I mean, there's some would say there's the possibility that you could have those at that particular time. That would be, but I still think that the view of, I mean, the thing is, there's definitely a statement there that they're entering their eternal destiny. So there is a sense in which their eternal destiny is determined at that particular point, but whether it's specifically Hades or the lake of fire, we'll look more into that in next week. Right, any other question on the millennial issue in particularly? Maybe what we could do now is let's do this. This might be a good time. We for sure need to cover the rapture issue, which is like the last really big issue to look at. What I would like the last day to be, in addition, I want to cover resurrections and judgments, particularly on let's just say in general, we need to cover rapture next time, and then I also want to cover resurrections and judgments and timelines in addition. Go ahead, Trent.
I'm not sure where this question fits in, so you can push this off if that's more helpful.
Sure.
Has to do with the tribulation and rapture and the millennial kingdom.
All right.
For dispensationalists, I know we understand believing saints in the tribulation who survive the tribulation are those who kind of enter the kingdom and populate it.
Right.
For a historic premill who sees the surviving saints go through the tribulation, be raptured and return glorified, who populates the kingdom for the historic premill view?
I think that's a problem for the post-trib view, but some have speculated that there are actually some unbelievers who make it through. Now, firstly, I think that's a problem. My personal view is I think only believers get into. Unless a man's born again, he can't enter the kingdom of heaven. So I think when it comes to that entrance into the kingdom, a person needs to be born again. So I personally haven't been convinced by the unbelievers getting in the kingdom view, but that is how some would argue. Some would argue is that when it comes to the judgment of the nations, the Zechariah 14 passage, the rest of those, almost kind of like there's some that kind of slip through the cracks. Some would take the judgment of the nations perhaps being more generic in general of national entities, but not maybe so much on every single individual. So they usually end up holding that there ends up being some that survive the tribulation and the initial judgments of the nations that's more of a national, not so much individual judgment, and therefore they go in. Yeah. So in other words, some would argue that there are just unbelievers that end up entering it who survive the tribulation and the judgments. That's personally not my view. I actually think that is a problem. If you ever read any of the views books on the rapture, that ends up being one of the focal points of the disagreements with the post-trib view, is both pre-trib and pre-wrath and mid-trib people pointing out we have a time period for people to get saved and to enter it into immortal bodies, but you don't, because it seems like everybody's would be glorified who was a believer at that time. Right, so this might be a good time to do this instead of just jumping right into the rapture. Let's maybe do a little bit of a timeline. Again, as I do this timeline, I'm just going to give it to you in a big picture, which means when it comes to explaining some of the specifics, particularly I think like in regard to the Great White Throne and the sheep-goat judgment, we're going to talk more specifically about that later. But just to point out generally how I'd see it. As things are playing out, this is the quote, the big picture is how I would see it. And again, this scale, I'm a horrible artist, so just you guys already know that. This obviously isn't according to scale, but it seemed to me that you would have, I would say that you end up having, the church age. Okay, so we know it's roughly 2,000 years, plus. I think what you end up having after that is the tribulation, which I would also refer to as Daniel's 70th week. Which is a seven-year period. I'm going to put the bigger ones up here first, and then I would see there being a millennium. And you would end up having here a release of Satan and a rebellion. And then pretty quickly after that you would have a great white throne judgment. Great white throne. And then you would end up having the eternal state. So at this particular time, I'm trying to put the bigger ones out there. We have a church age today. I think there is a tribulation period, which I would also refer to as the day of the Lord. Of course, there's a million things you could put into specifics of this. Okay, then you end up having a millennial kingdom, and then a couple events after that: a release of Satan, a great white throne judgment, and then the eternal state. Which, if we were to put this according to scale, eternity goes on into infinity future. So the millennium ends up being a little dot when you put it into eternity future. So, although we haven't discussed yet why I would hold to a pre-rapture, I would hold here that there ends up being a rapture. The rapture of the church. And this would be, 1 Thess 4. We'll get more into that later. I think Revelation 3:10, which in the context is talking about a global judgment, so I think it takes it beyond just the church being the specific church at that time. Seems to be a promise of God for those who are faithful through the tribulation that they're going through now. They're going to escape the big tribulation. the hour of trial that's to come upon the whole earth. So I think the purpose of the rapture is it's a promise by God's sovereign decree that those who are believers before it, because they've been faithful, they don't have to go through this period. So I think there is going to be a rapture of the church. I do think there's a tribulation period. It's a time of Jacob's trouble. I think it's possible that during this particular time in heaven that you might have what's referred to as the Bema judgment. I will say when it comes to all the details of the timings of eschatology, I think when you get into the judgment seat of Christ, that's mentioned in 2 Corinthians 5 and 1 Corinthians 3, when it comes to the timing of that event, that's one of the more harder things to discern. But I do think it's possible that you could have the Bema judgment for the church taking place in heaven during this particular time. During the tribulation period, it appeared to me to be at the midway point, that you would end up having the abomination of desolation. Abomination of desolation. Would definitely probably see the birth pangs during the first half, and then the more intense aspect of the tribulation in the second part. Seemed to me at the end of the period you're going to end up having the second coming of Jesus. Technically, let's see here. And I think with the second coming of Jesus, you would end up having the sheep-goat judgment. And then you would enter the millennial kingdom. So, church age, rapture, Bema judgment in heaven, Daniel's 70th week, which I would also refer to as the day of the Lord, second coming of Christ, sheep-goat judgment, millennium. Might as well look at the in Revelation. There's other verses in Revelation 20. Look at Revelation 20. Let's start in verse 7. Revelation 20, verse 7 says, when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison. So notice that he's been sent to the abyss. Now he's released from his prison. And then in verse 8 it says, and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, which I would take to be Jerusalem. So I think this does indicate that the Jerusalem of the millennial kingdom at this particular point will come under a siege. But notice what happens. And fire came down from heaven and devoured them. Verse 10, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever. I think this is, again, a pretty strong indicator here of a millennial gap. Because if you go back to Revelation 20, now again, notice what it mentions here. It mentioned the beast and the false prophet who were thrown into the lake of fire, right? And then when you come to Revelation 20, it indicates here that in verse 3 that Satan at this time threw him into the abyss. So notice you have these two members that are thrown into the lake of fire. Now you have Satan that's thrown in the abyss. And then it explicitly says at the end of verse 3 that he won't deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years are completed. Then after these things, he must be released for a short time. So when you get here to verse 7, when it talks about the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison. Notice that when you're in Revelation, the first verses of Revelation 20, he's not in the lake of fire yet. He's in the abyss. So he's released from his prison, but then when you look at verse 10, it indicates here that when the devil who deceived them was thrown, and the devil, after this rebellion, who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire, and the brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also. So I think that's pretty significant there, that you see a distinction in his destinies. I think just a whole other interesting thing is the whole progression of how Christ is dealing with Satan throughout this particular period. I mean, I think you see distinct movements. I mean, if you look at Revelation 12 verse 7, it says, "And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. But he was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." So in that case, there's a reference to his being thrown to the earth. Then when you get to Revelation chapter 20, he's thrown into the abyss for a period of time. And then when you get to Revelation 20, verse 10, after the 1,000 years, he's thrown into the lake of fire. So personally, I would say the huge victory is accomplished at the cross as far as salvation and being broken from the power of Satan. But like many warfares that we've seen throughout history, you can have a fatal blow, and yet there can be stages of the battle still carried out. You have the Normandy invasion in World War II, but that doesn't end the war at that particular point. It's one that breaks the enemy's back, but there's things that progress. So let me just say, when it comes to eschatology, I see a lot of stages and phases. I see phases of the Abrahamic covenant and Davidic covenant and New Covenant. I'm seeing phases in the kingdom program. I'm seeing phases in the Day of the Lord program, phases in how he's dealing with Satan, phases in the resurrection and judgment program. Of course, I think all of that is part of God's sovereign decree to bring glory to himself as you see those come about. Okay, so I think I got the big ones up here. So you end up having rapture, tribulation, coming of Christ, sheep, goat, judgment, millennium, release of Satan, great white throne, and then eternal state. Any questions or thought? Go ahead.
So obviously millennium is Israel's restoration.
Yeah.
As far as their salvation goes, does that happen in the tribulation? Or does it happen?
I think at the very end, yeah.
Because it says, they'll look upon him who they pierce. So does that happen at the second coming? Does there seem to be some kind of gap, like when Jesus comes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that there's differences of opinion even amongst those that might be real similar, premillennialist in their view. So in other words, Israel's relationship to the second coming, is it the actual return of Christ that causes them to believe, or is, in a sense, is their belief occur before the second coming? I think it's the latter. I think Israel, as a result of Israel's salvation, the second coming takes place. So, and part of the reason for that is, as I've argued earlier, I think there's a sense in which the fullness of the kingdom is linked with national Israel's acceptance of their Messiah. But to go back to a passage we've looked at before, I would also argue that from Acts 3:19-21. Where it says, remember this passage? He's speaking to the men of Israel, by the way. If you go back up to verse 12, who's he speaking to? Men of Israel. These are the same people that had Christ crucified. Then in verse 19, therefore, he's telling them, repent and return. Well, what will happen if they get saved? That your sins may be wiped away. And then notice that, in order that, after your sins have been wiped away, in order that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, that he may send Jesus the Christ appointed for you. So I think that you're seeing Israel being called to get saved, to find forgiveness, and then it's linked with the second coming of Christ. So I think in God's sovereignty, he's decreed it that the salvation of all Israel is linked very, very closely to the actual timing of the second coming.